I woke up to a completely different scene than when I had passed out. I was still in the butcher room of the House of Horrors, but it was quiet and empty of the horrors I had witnessed. The terrible trio were not in the room, nor was Sam. The three men chained to the wall were silent. I couldn't bring myself to check if they were asleep or dead. I was so dazed that it took me a moment to realize that I was no longer tied up. I got to my feet slowly, terrified that if I moved too quickly, I would fall back over again. I glanced at the table where my best friend had just been brutally tortured before being beheaded with a rusty axe. It looked the same as it did when we originally trespassed. For a brief moment, I thought I had dreamt the whole thing. Maybe I had just had a bout of vertigo and passed out during our quest to be rebellious, and my subconscious made up this terrifying ordeal to match my surroundings and desire for a scare. Maybe Sam ran to get help for me, and I had never witnessed his agonizing and gruesome end. I walked out of the entrance of the house. I had no desire to see what horrors it had in store anymore. I was trying to be stealthy, since I was still trespassing. But I was lightheaded and clumsy. I stumbled out of the front door and right into the dirty clown. He laughed as I ran away from him. I made it to the fence and searched frantically for the hole Sam and I had cut. After a minute or two, I found it. It had been closed with zip ties. I had climbed about halfway up the fence when I felt a hand grasp my ankle tightly. I screamed as loud and kicked as hard as I could, but my captor was stronger than I. I fell to the ground, my breath knocked out of me. I felt a pair of hands grab me under my arms and lift me from the ground. I tried to run again, but whichever psycho grabbed me had a strong hold. I no longer believed everything was a dream. I knew I was going to die, and I knew it was going to be slow and painful. I went limp. I had lost all will to fight. It wasn't until I heard his voice, an unfamiliar voice, that I realized that this man wasn't one of Sam's killers. I was handcuffed and led to a police car that was parked outside of the fairgrounds. The officer that had pulled me off the fence didn't want to hear my story about my friend being tortured and killed in front of me. He thought I was making it up to try to get myself out of the serious trouble I was in. It wasn't until we were at the station and I was downright hysterical that they decided to call Sam's parents. A 2-minute conversation revealed that he wasn't in his bed, where he should be, and the search started. I was left in a holding cell while the police looked for my accomplice. I was happy to be there, because it meant the clown and his cronies couldn't get me. I sat in the small cell for a few hours before the police chief himself came to get me. He led me to a small room with 2 chairs and a table, which had a can of Pepsi waiting for me. After downing half the can, I told the chief everything that had happened. After my confession, he made one of his own. They had gone to the fairgrounds and checked the House of Horrors. They found nothing. The men were no longer on the walls, and there was no evidence that a real person had hung from the chains that were gone as well. The house was closed off so that a forensic team could go in and test the butcher room for real blood. The person who ran the Halloween festival had given the police the address of the people who set up the house every year, but it turned out to be a home that had been abandoned for some time. They were still looking for Sam, and for the clown, woman, and man who allegedly killed him. The chief agreed that everything was mighty suspicious, but so far there was nothing to prove my story other than Sam's absence. He mused that Sam might have realized you were going to get busted and ran off. I was sent home with my parents. I spent the next week holed up in my room. Even if I was allowed to go outside, which my parents had forbidden since I had been arrested, I was terrified that I would run into and be taken by the three who had taken my friend from me. Sam still hadn't been found. His face was on every newscast, shown above the number for the hotline the police had set up for information or anonymous tips. I refused to go to school. I barely ate. I barely slept. And I rarely talked. My parents sat me down and talked about taking me to see a therapist. I didn't want to do that, so I agreed that I would go out with my cousin. He was a year older than me, and I spent almost as much time with him as I did with Sam that evening, and go back to school the following Monday. My cousin, Tom, and I went to see a new comedy at the movie theatre in the next town over. We joked and threw popcorn, and, though it was an act at first, I genuinely had a good time. After the movie, we went back to my house. My parents were next door playing cards with the neighbors. We sat in the living room and got lost in the millions of hilarious YouTube videos for a couple of hours. It was around 11 p.m. when we heard a crash upstairs. We ran to see what the noise was, checking every room for the cause. I opened the door to my room, the last door in the hall. My bedroom was in the rear corner of the house, with a window that overlooked the side yard and one that faced the back. The window that looked into the backyard was smashed. Directly below it, my bed was covered in glass. In the middle of my comforter sat a large object that had been wrapped in some type of dirty cloth. Ignoring my pleas to leave it alone, Tom removed the soiled linen. He dropped the object with a loud scream. Sam's decomposing head rolled across the floor and stopped at my feet.